Hey guys, Nike here, and today I'm bringing you a video that I think many or even most people in the Guild Wars community will disagree with me on, but I still think it's worth having the discussion. The topic is vertical progression and power creep in Guild Wars 2, where we are, where I think we're going, and what it means. If that interests you, strap in, because this might be longer than normal. Alright, so we're going to start with power creep because I think that's the simplest and most digestible thing for most people. In the last 2 years, we've had significant increases in the amount of DPS that DPS classes and hybrid support DPS classes can output, though in fact the power of pure support builds has mostly stayed flat once heal mech got balanced. Power creep is, for better or worse, accessibility. Every time they raise the skill floor a few percent, more players can engage with the content, whether that be strike CMs, fractal CMs, or anything in open world or story that the player finds challenging on a personal level. Fortunately for ANET, they've raised the skill ceiling at the same time, which means that good players don't lose any sense of skill expression. This is controversial, but take it from me. Any so-called good player who argues that their skill expression is diminished either doesn't understand what they're talking about, or they might be mistaken about how expressive their skills are in the first place. The nightmare scenario would be raising the floor but not raising the ceiling, which squishes the bad players and the good players together, and essentially makes good players feel like putting in effort is unrewarded because they don't get higher output. It could be argued that long-term that might even be a positive thing, as other games have a much tighter window of skill expression, or in fact that it would be better if the game had been designed that way from the start. But where we currently sit, it would be at least a medium-term and definitely a short-term negative. If it's not obvious from the way I've constructed this passage, I am fine with the power creep we've experienced, and I think overall it is a very net positive for the game. Now, that doesn't mean that endless power creep would automatically be good, but I do think there is still room for more power creep without hurting the game on a fundamental, systematic level. For me, the biggest space for some growth is something that would slightly lower overall skill progression, but I do think the net benefit would be worthwhile, and that is buffing auto attacks. My contention is that if a larger portion of DPS rotations were auto attacks, it would greatly simplify gameplay and simultaneously make players able to focus on mechanical execution, since they won't have to devote so much of their limited attention towards their rotation. This would make more builds go from high to medium intensity and make many medium intensity builds become low intensity builds. And in the last few years, we've seen the clear benefit that lower intensity builds have had for the community. The fear, of course, is that this would drastically lower skill expression, and I believe that if they got the balance wrong, that might in fact happen by buffing auto attacks. But there is a happy medium where rotations would go from, let's say, 13 unique skill presses and 10% auto attacks to 8 unique skill presses and 25% auto attacks. I don't believe this would greatly damage the high-end community nearly as much as it would help the low to medium-end community members master the game and master the content more easily. And quite frankly, there aren't that many high-end community players left, and if some percentage of them quit the game, that's not nearly as impactful as the hundreds or thousands of extra players ANET would retain by making their game more playable to a larger mass of people. So that's enough about power creep. Let's talk about vertical progression. Vertical progression has been a taboo word in the community forever, and we've been told to sing the praises of horizontal progression. But I think there is a bit of a blind spot in the community. It's very clear, at least to me, that we've had significant vertical progression in the game. Elite specs are clearly and unarguably vertical progression, and no one sane would deny that. Mounts are another example of vertical progression. Using a mount is strictly better than not using them. Using elite specs is strictly better than not using them. Many masteries themselves are clearly vertical progression. You are more powerful and your potential is higher if you've leveled up the masteries than if you didn't. That is definitionally vertical progression. What Guild Wars 2 doesn't have is vertical gear progression, and that is good. Each new X-Pack doesn't raise the level cap and doesn't introduce a new tier of gear. This much we all agree on, and for the most part everyone likes it. But don't be confused. Just because there isn't gear progression doesn't mean there isn't vertical progression. And I have some more news for you. Even though future expansions won't have elite specs, they will have vertical progression. In fact, my guess is that the vertical progression will accelerate as each X-Pack verticality will compound, as they have already in the past. Soto will have new weapons and access to weapons from previous elite specs, which, compared to an elite spec, is relatively tame. But I expect future expansions to add far more ambitious vertical progression. And I'll be blunt about this. If what I'm saying about vertical progression and continuing power creep bothers you significantly, save yourself a bunch of time and quit the game now, because it's coming and you can't stop it, and complaining about it will avail you nothing. So, for example, let's say a future X-Pack adds a new trinket slot, like a belt. It's not adding a new tier of gear, so it's not gear progression, but it is a new gear slot, and that would, of course, represent power creep and vertical character progression. It's easy to envision the belt slot not even having stats, but having some other bonus, like a free trait. Perhaps an Ellie can complete a long quest chain and get a belt that allocates fresh air. Meaning that with that belt equipped, Ellie would have the fresh air trait even if he used Bolt to the Heart, or even if he didn't use air magic at all. Is that OP? Heck yeah, it is. Is that so far out of the realm of possibility for a future X-Pack? It's not. Maybe they would limit it to adept traits to keep it somewhat in check. Who knows? It's not the point. I'm just giving an example of potential future vertical progression that could in fact come. It might not be anything similar to that, but don't get it twisted. Something like this will come. Players will get new, powerful build expanding options with each X-Pack that give more player power and thus vertical progression. You can bank on that, because ANET is certainly going to bank on it. If this is unacceptable to you, again, quit now, because it's coming. Will this mean that in 5 years from now, 10 literal randoms with no coherent team comp will be able to kill Veil Guardian without any sort of organization? Probably. But quite frankly, who cares? If you attach any of your self-esteem or your personal pride to the fact that you can beat Veil Guardian and 10 noobs can't, that's something you need to work through, and it's not ANET's job to protect your ego in that regard. It's their job to sell X-Packs, and they will sell it with continued vertical progression. Anyway, guys, that's it for me. That's where I'm going to leave the conversation for today. Thank you guys for watching. Please leave any comments you have on power creep and vertical progression, or power creep and vertical progression down below. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I will see you next time.